Kellyanne Conway leaned back in her chair with the kind of confidence only years of media sparring can create. Her voice, sharp and laced with condescension, cut through the room. "People like you," she sneered, eyes narrowing at Jasmine Crockett, "never understand the bigger picture. You're too emotional, too inexperienced, too small for this stage." The words landed like a slap, designed to belittle, to strip Crockett of legitimacy before she could even open her mouth. The audience stirred. A few gasps, a ripple of uncomfortable laughter, the low hum of people shifting in their seats. Some nodded at Conway's smugness, others looked away, uneasy at the raw arrogance on display. It was the kind of dismissal Conway had perfected, smooth, rehearsed, and dripping with superiority. For a moment, it seemed like yet another segment where the spin doctor would dominate through sheer audacity. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't stumble over words or show a flicker of anger. Instead, she paused, her silence louder than Conway's insult. Her eyes locked on Conway's with calm precision, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a controlled power that pierced through the noise. "Small?" Crockett repeated softly, almost amused. Then, in a steady tone that cut sharper than any shout, she said, "It's always telling when the loudest voices have the weakest arguments. Size doesn't matter when truth stands taller than spin." The air cracked. The crowd erupted, not with polite applause but with cheers that rose like a wave. Some stood, clapping, others laughed in disbelief at how swiftly the tables had turned. In mere seconds, Crockett's reply had flipped the entire dynamic. Conway's smirk faltered, her posture stiffened, and for the first time her polished armor showed cracks. It was the kind of moment you replay in your head, the kind that spreads across social media within minutes. One cutting line, one flash of composure, and the so-called giant looked suddenly very small. And in just seconds, Conway's entire argument was in shambles. But how did Crockett dismantle Conway so quickly? To understand, we have to rewind. The confrontation didn't happen in some quiet, private exchange. It unfolded under the hottest lights possible, inside a crowded hearing room packed with journalists, aides, and citizens eager to witness sparks fly. The cameras panned, lenses glinting like 1,000 watchful eyes, feeding every word, every glance, every smirk directly into the bloodstream of American media. This wasn't just another political debate. This was theater, power, and truth colliding on a stage where reputations could be made or destroyed in a single breath. Kellyanne Conway entered that room as she had so many others before, sure of herself, armed with years of experience bending narratives, and known for her uncanny ability to twist even the most obvious truth into something slippery and elusive. To her supporters, she was a strategist without rival. To her critics, she was the architect of manipulation, the very face of alternative facts. For a long time, she had thrived in this chaos, overwhelming opponents with a flood of words, a barrage of confidence, and the spectacle of spectacle itself. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, whose rise had been quieter, but no less powerful. Unlike Conway, Crockett's strength wasn't built on spin. It was built on clarity, on her refusal to bow to the arrogance of those who believed shouting could replace substance. Crockett came from a background where words were weapons not of confusion, but of defense. Defense of the marginalized, the unheard, the dismissed. And in this moment, the collision between these two figures represented more than just a clash of personalities. It symbolized a larger battle raging across the country. Truth versus manipulation, dignity versus derision. The audience felt it. You could see it in the way people leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the two women like spectators at a high-stakes duel. The hum of anticipation filled the air, the sense that something historic was brewing. This wasn't just Conway versus Crockett. It was old politics versus new courage. It was arrogance tested against authenticity. Every gesture, every word mattered. Conway's dismissiveness wasn't just aimed at Crockett. It was aimed at everyone Crockett represented. Immigrants, women, progressives, truth seekers. By belittling her, Conway hoped to belittle them all. And yet, the silence that followed Crockett's poised expression suggested something Conway had not accounted for: resilience. The stakes could not have been higher. A nation tuned in not simply to watch words exchanged, but to feel something: validation, outrage, inspiration. And as Crockett sat steady, her composure unshaken, it became clear this was not the usual script Conway had mastered. The old playbook of arrogance might not hold. The clash mattered because it was more than two individuals sparring. It was a referendum on how politics would be conducted in the future. Would arrogance and manipulation continue to dominate the national conversation, or would dignity and truth finally pierce through the noise? The audience held its breath, the cameras zoomed closer, and Conway prepared her next line, confident she would again control the narrative. But she didn't know what was coming. The words Conway didn't expect were about to end her dominance. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand Kellyanne Conway. For years, she has been more than a political strategist. She has been a master illusionist in the arena of American politics. While others relied on policy expertise or painstaking logic, Conway specialized in something more slippery, turning reality itself into a weapon. She rose to national prominence not because she made arguments stronger, but because she made the truth harder to pin down. Her gift was not persuasion in the traditional sense. It was distortion. In television studios across the country, she perfected a brand of deflection that left opponents frustrated and viewers dizzy. Ask her about a scandal and she'd redirect to an unrelated attack. Challenge her with facts and she'd counter with what became her infamous phrase, alternative facts. That single line etched her into political history, a soundbite that summed up an era where truth itself seemed negotiable. Conway wielded that skill like armor. Each time she was cornered, she slipped away with a smirk and a clever retort. Her critics called her cynical, her admirers praised her as brilliant. Either way, she played the game well. Few could match her ability to dominate a conversation, not with substance, but with sheer audacity. She spoke quickly, smiled often, and always projected confidence, even when the ground beneath her arguments crumbled. This was the reputation Conway carried into every room, the woman who could not be rattled, the woman who thrived in chaos. She fed off it. The more heated the exchange, the more comfortable she seemed. Arguments weren't contests of truth for her. They were contests of stamina, of who could stay standing after the storm. And by that measure, Conway had reigned undefeated for years. But woven into her dominance was an arrogance that became impossible to ignore. She dismissed challengers not because their points lacked merit, but because she believed herself untouchable. She leaned on sarcasm, patronizing tones, and verbal traps meant to embarrass rather than enlighten. Time and again she treated opponents, especially women and people of color, as obstacles to swat aside rather than equals in debate. It was this pattern that made audiences expect Conway to dominate the moment with Jasmine Crockett. To many, it seemed a foregone conclusion. Crockett, younger and less seasoned on the national stage, would be steamrolled by Conway's relentless confidence. Conway had faced seasoned journalists and veteran politicians, and even when cornered, she somehow walked away with the spotlight. Why should this be any different? And yet, beneath that surface of confidence lay contradictions Conway could never quite escape. She branded herself as a defender of American values while twisting those very values into knots. She portrayed herself as a truth-teller while bending truth until it broke. She spoke of respect and civility, yet routinely laced her rhetoric with mockery and dismissal. Her public image was a carefully constructed mask, one that hid fragility behind a wall of bravado. That mask had held strong for years. She'd sparred with the fiercest interviewers, outlasted scandal after scandal, and become a symbol of the political storm itself, unyielding, unpredictable, untouchable. People expected her to thrive that night because chaos was her home field. Give her a microphone, a stage, and a crowd, and she would turn every confrontation into another showcase of her dominance. But what no one accounted for was the one force Conway had never truly faced: calm composure. For all her years mastering chaos, she had never stood against someone who refused to play the game on her terms. Someone who would not be baited, who would not be rattled, who would not descend into the mud with her. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. And as Conway smirked and delivered her cutting dismissal, she believed she was scripting yet another victory. But what she didn't realize was that the very arrogance she relied upon was about to backfire. Because Conway never faced someone like Crockett. Until now. To truly grasp why Jasmine Crockett's words struck like lightning, you have to know where she came from. Crockett was not born into the halls of power, nor did she inherit the privileges that smooth the path for so many in politics. Her roots were in struggle, in sacrifice, in a life shaped by the hard edges of reality rather than the polished stagecraft of spin. Before she was a lawmaker, before the cameras ever turned in her direction, Jasmine Crockett was an attorney, a fighter in the trenches, standing for those society tried to silence. She cut her teeth defending clients who couldn't afford to be heard. The poor, the marginalized, the overlooked. These were the people she represented. Courtrooms became her battlegrounds and justice was her weapon. Every case taught her something Conway had never learned: that real power doesn't come from dominating a conversation, it comes from telling the truth clearly, even when the odds are stacked against you. Her legal career was never about prestige. it was about survival. She went head-to-head with prosecutors who underestimated her, judges who doubted her, and opponents who thought they could intimidate her. But time after time, Crockett proved that underestimation was her greatest advantage. Where others relied on arrogance, she relied on preparation. Where others used theatrics, she used facts. And where others shouted to be heard, she learned the art of making silence work for her until the moment came to speak with devastating precision. That same spirit carried her into activism. When communities cried out against injustice, Crockett stood among them, not above them. She marched, she organized, she spoke truth in spaces where truth was treated as dangerous. Her authenticity wasn't something she put on for cameras. It was forged in the streets, in late-night meetings, in quiet conversations with people who felt invisible. She didn't chase power for its own sake. She chased the chance to make those voices louder. By the time Crockett entered politics, she was already battle-tested. But in Washington's polished corridors, authenticity can be seen as weakness. Conway and those like her thrived on image, tailored outfits, rehearsed lines, the gleam of practiced smiles. Crockett, by contrast, brought something raw, something unfiltered, something that made establishment figures nervous. She didn't dress her truths in pretty language. She didn't soften her tone to make arrogance more comfortable. She told it as it was, and in a world addicted to spin, that honesty was her most dangerous weapon. Yet she remained underestimated. Commentators dismissed her as too new, too brash, or too emotional. Opponents believed they could rattle her, drown her out, reduce her presence to a footnote. But they didn't understand that Crockett's resilience had been forged long before she ever walked into a political hearing. Years of courtroom battles had taught her patience. Years of advocacy had sharpened her resolve. Years of standing shoulder to shoulder with the unheard had instilled in her a simple, unshakable belief. Dignity would always outlast arrogance. That belief was her secret weapon. Not wit, not sarcasm, not theatrical outrage, calm clarity. In a system where shouting matches often took center stage, Crockett's ability to stay grounded, to listen deeply before striking, made her dangerous in ways opponents didn't see coming. While Conway relied on speed and chaos, Crockett relied on timing. And when timing is everything, the one who stays calm always wins. Her authenticity versus Conway's polish framed the clash like a collision of two worlds. Conway embodied the old politics of manipulation, where words were tools to distort. Crockett embodied a new politics of candor, where words were tools to reveal. Conway smirked because she believed polish would always overshadow authenticity. But Crockett knew authenticity, when delivered with precision, could cut sharper than any practiced spin. It was this contrast that electrified the audience the moment they saw the two women share the stage. On one side, Conway, the veteran, the strategist, the manipulator. On the other, Crockett, the underdog, the fighter, the truth-teller. Few expected the underdog to prevail. Fewer still believed she could dismantle someone as slippery as Conway. And yet, those who had followed Crockett's journey knew she had been underestimated before, and it never ended well for those who made that mistake. The story of Jasmine Crockett was never one of shortcuts or easy victories. It was a story of climbing, of persistence, of standing tall when others tried to force her to shrink. That night was no different. Conway believed her arrogance would drown out Crockett's presence. But Crockett had something Conway could neither predict nor control, a calm clarity that could turn a single moment into history. And it was that very clarity that would spark the takedown heard across the room. The room seemed to vibrate with tension as the exchange deepened. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward now, her words coming faster, sharper, dripping with the condescension that had long been her trademark. Her tone was the practiced mix of derision and false concern, the kind that sounded less like debate and more like a scolding. "You see, Congresswoman," she said with that thin, knowing smile, "this is why people don't take your side seriously. You're blinded by passion. You confuse noise with knowledge. It's cute, but politics is a grown-up game." The word cute landed with a thud. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a deliberate attempt to shrink Jasmine Crockett in front of the crowd. A murmur rippled through the audience, half discomfort, half anticipation. Cameras zoomed closer, searching for Crockett's reaction, hoping to catch a flicker of rage or indignation. But none came. Crockett sat still, her posture relaxed, almost serene. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fire back. She simply watched Conway, her eyes steady, her lips curled in the faintest suggestion of a smile. It was the look of someone who had already seen through the performance and was waiting for the right moment to reveal it for what it was. The audience shifted uneasily. Some looked from Conway to Crockett and back again, as though trying to decode the silence. The more Conway talked, the more obvious her aggression became. Her voice rose, her gestures sharpened, her laughter took on an edge of desperation masked as confidence. Yet the silence across from her made it all feel hollow, like a storm lashing against an immovable cliff. Passion doesn't build policy, Conway continued, stabbing the air with her finger. Slogans don't solve problems. And frankly, when you spend more time grandstanding than governing, it's no wonder the serious people tune you out. That's the difference between you and me, ideal in reality while you're chasing applause. The irony of that line wasn't lost on the crowd. A few chuckles broke out, not at Crockett, but at the audacity of Conway painting herself as the voice of reality. Still, she pressed on, her confidence swelling with each word. To her, Crockett's silence was a sign of weakness, proof that her barrage was working. But those who knew Jasmine Crockett understood what was happening. This wasn't weakness, it was patience. It was restraint sharpened into strategy. Every second of silence tightened the tension, wound the spring. Conway was burning fuel, louder and more frantic with every jab, while Crockett conserved her energy, preparing for a single devastating release. The crowd leaned forward now, restless, caught between discomfort and anticipation. It felt like watching a high-wire act, everyone waiting for the moment the balance tipped. Conway filled the silence with more smirks, more sarcasm, convinced she was winning the exchange simply by dominating the air. She mistook Crockett's stillness for surrender, never realizing it was the calm before the storm. And then, just as Conway launched into another sweeping dismissal, just as the smug certainty dripped from her every syllable, Crockett drew in a slow breath, lifted her gaze and prepared to speak. The room fell quiet. The cameras froze. Time seemed to pause. And then, with the sharpness of a blade, Crockett finally struck. For a moment, the silence was almost unbearable. Kellyanne Conway's last words still echoed in the chamber, smug and heavy, as though she believed they would hang there forever, unchallenged. But then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, deliberate, cutting through the tension like the first crack of thunder in a brewing storm. "You know, Miss Conway," she began, her tone calm, almost conversational, "I've noticed something about people who rely on insults. They never seem to notice that insults don't build anything. They only reveal what you don't have." The words dropped into the air with a thud. The audience stiffened, murmurs rippling as if everyone suddenly sensed the tide turning. Conway blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face before the mask of confidence returned. But Crockett wasn't rushing. She was pacing herself, laying one brick of her argument at a time. "You called me small. You called me cute. You said passion doesn't belong in politics. Let me ask you, what do you think built this country if not passion? What do you think sustained generations of people who fought for freedom, equality, and justice, if not passion?" Crockett's voice grew firmer now, not louder, but heavier, resonating deeper with every word. The crowd responded with a low rumble of approval. Heads nodded. Hands slapped the table. Conway shifted slightly in her chair. "And as for being small," Crockett continued, pausing just long enough to make the silence feel intentional, "history has never been changed by those who look down on others from pedestals. It has always been changed by the people they dismissed. Women who were told to stay silent. Workers told they didn't matter. Communities told they were invisible. Time and again, the so-called small people are the ones who make the biggest changes." Gasps followed this, then a burst of applause that the moderator struggled in vain to quiet. Conway pursed her lips, her hand tightening on the table. Crockett leaned back slightly, letting the applause rise and fall before speaking again. Her timing was surgical, every pause sharpening the blade of her words. "And let's talk about experience," she said. "You've made a career out of twisting reality. You've become famous for creating alternative facts." A ripple of laughter broke out at the phrase, the audience catching the sting instantly. "But the truth is, alternative facts aren't facts at all. They're just excuses dressed up in prettier words." The laughter swelled into cheers. Cameras caught Conway's face tightening, her once confident smile straining at the edges. Crockett pressed on. "You call my voice too emotional. You call it too loud. But the truth is, you're not afraid of my passion, you're afraid of what it represents. Because every time someone like me refuses to bow to arrogance, it chips away at the old way of doing politics. Every time we refuse to accept spin as truth, it pulls the mask off those who built their careers on distortion. And that, Miss Conway, is what really rattles you." The audience erupted again, clapping and shouting in support. Conway shifted in her seat, trying to regain composure, but the ground was slipping beneath her. Crockett wasn't finished. Her words began to build now, gathering force like a wave. You talk about reality as though you own it. But reality isn't what you spin in a studio. Reality is what families live every day when they can't pay their bills. Reality is what workers feel when they're told they're expendable. Reality is what immigrants face when they're treated like second-class citizens. That is the reality you ignore while you laugh and sneer. That is the reality I carry into every single room I enter. The room thundered with approval, the sound echoing against the walls. Even those who had walked in neutral, unsure, were caught up in the electricity. Conway tried to interject, opening her mouth with a tight smile, but the moderator silenced her with a raised hand. The crowd wanted to hear Crockett finish. And then came the crescendo. Crockett leaned forward again, her voice quieter now, but sharper for it, forcing the room to lean in with her. You can call me small, Miss Conway. You can call me cute. You can dismiss me all you like. But remember this, every empire that thought it was too big to fall was eventually brought down by the very people it mocked. And if standing up for truth, for dignity, and for the people you choose to ignore makes me small, then I will gladly be small, because this so-called small voice just exposed how empty your arguments really are. The chamber exploded. Applause, cheers, even laughter filled the room. Some rose to their feet, clapping with the kind of intensity reserved for moments that feel historic. Conway sat frozen, her composure cracking, the polished armor of her persona suddenly transparent. She fumbled for words, her mouth opening and closing, but no spin came to rescue her this time. Crockett sat back, calm again, the faintest smile on her lips. She didn't need to add more. The counterattack had landed, not just against Conway's points, but against her very method of argument. She had dismantled not only the insult but the system of spin itself. The crowd knew it. The cameras knew it. And Conway, for all her years of thriving in chaos, finally seemed out of place in the storm she once commanded. The room erupted. But outside those walls, the impact was just beginning. The sound inside the chamber did not die quickly. It rolled and thundered, echoing against the wood-paneled walls like the roar of a stadium crowd. Some people stood, clapping with abandon, while others leaned over to whisper in disbelief. Did that just happen? Kellyanne Conway sat stiffly, her face straining to hold its familiar mask of control, but the applause drowned her silence. For once, the woman who thrived on spectacle found herself outshined by it. The cheers were not hers to claim. They belonged entirely to Jasmine Crockett. Outside the chamber, the moment spread like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's takedown hit Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The hashtags arrived almost instantly, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag truth over spin, and the one that climbed to #1 by sundown, hashtag small but mighty. Every replay captured the same sequence: the smug dismissal, Crockett's measured silence, and then the words that turned the room upside down. Each replay carried with it the same electric surge of satisfaction for audiences who had long waited for someone to puncture Conway's aura of invincibility. Memes flooded the timelines. One side-by-side image showed Conway sneering above the caption, "Alternative Facts," while beneath it Crockett stood steady, captioned, "Actual Truth." Another used the iconic freeze-frame style, Conway mid-smirk, the text reading, "She thought she had the upper hand," followed by Crockett's calm reply, "But then reality checked in." Late-night comedians had their material ready by sundown, replaying Crockett's line with gleeful exaggeration and calling it the shortest demolition in political history. News outlets scrambled. Cable panels replayed the clip with analysis bordering on awe. Pundits who once described Conway as untouchable admitted they had never seen her so visibly rattled. Journalists who had tried for years to corner Conway in interviews remarked on how Crockett had accomplished in seconds what entire news cycles could not. She cut through the fog of spin with one unflinching reply. Influencers piled on, recording reaction videos where they paused at the moment Crockett delivered her line, shouting at their screens, clapping, or laughing with cathartic joy. TikTok was filled with reenactments, people lip-syncing Crockett's words while dressed in everything from power suits to casual hoodies, reclaiming the mic drop moment as their own. On Instagram, quote graphics of her speech circulated like gospel verses, shared across progressive accounts, immigrant advocacy pages, and grassroots organizations. But it wasn't just the online chatter. Celebrities added their voices. Actors, musicians, and activists tweeted their praise. "That's how you handle arrogance," one posted, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another wrote, "Crockett didn't just win an argument, she gave America a reminder that dignity still matters." Even a few unexpected voices, those who didn't always align with her politics, chimed in, admitting that the composure she displayed was undeniable. Voters too weighed in. Town halls and comment sections filled with people saying they had replayed the clip over and over, showing it to friends, sending it to family members. Many spoke of feeling seen in Crockett's calm defiance, her refusal to shrink in the face of someone who tried to belittle her. She spoke for all of us who've been talked down to, one comment read. She turned an insult into empowerment. The shockwaves traveled beyond celebration. Strategists whispered that the moment could shift political tides, that Crockett had cemented herself as a rising star. Opponents scrambled to spin the exchange differently, but the raw footage was impossible to reshape. The internet had already crowned its victor, and once the crowd takes hold of a narrative, it rarely lets go. Still, there was something more at work than just virality. Beneath the memes and hashtags, beneath the laughter and applause, something deeper was beginning to stir. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. They weren't just sharing the clip to laugh at Conway's downfall. They were sharing it because it felt like a glimpse of what politics could be if truth were allowed to stand tall again. But beyond the memes, something deeper was unfolding. The applause eventually faded, but the resonance of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered long after the room grew quiet. For those who witnessed it either in person or through the endless replays online, it became clear that this clash wasn't merely about two individuals sparring across a stage. It was a confrontation between two very different forces: arrogance against dignity, manipulation against clarity, spin against truth. And in that battle, the outcome revealed a deeper lesson about what people are truly hungry for in this moment of American history. Crockett's reply was more than a sharp counterpunch. It was a demonstration of calm courage in the face of smug dismissal. Where Conway leaned on volume, spectacle, and arrogance, Crockett chose patience, precision, and composure. That contrast mattered. It spoke to something many Americans feel on a daily basis: the exhaustion of being talked over, dismissed, or gaslit by those who hold power. By refusing to mirror Conway's hostility, Crockett offered a model of strength that did not rely on theatrics. She showed that dignity itself could be the sharpest weapon in the room. And this is where the moral clarity of the moment emerged. People are starved for truth-tellers. In an age of noise and spin where alternative facts can dominate a news cycle, there is a collective yearning for voices who cut through the fog with honesty. Crockett embodied that yearning. She didn't just dismantle a bad argument, she reminded everyone watching that arrogance crumbles when it collides with integrity. This hunger isn't partisan, it's human. Communities across the nation, from immigrants who have been told they don't belong, to young activists fighting for change, to everyday citizens weary of manipulation, saw themselves reflected in Crockett's composure. She wasn't just answering Conway, she was standing for all those who've been underestimated, interrupted, or belittled, and showing that silence followed by truth can be more powerful than 1,000 empty words. What unfolded on that stage was not the fall of one individual, but the exposure of an entire method, a way of dominating through ridicule, through chaos, through arrogance. For years, Conway had thrived in that environment. Yet Crockett revealed the weakness at its core. Arrogance burns fast, but dignity endures. In a single exchange, she reframed the contest. No longer was it about who could shout louder or spin harder. It became about who could stand taller. And the answer was undeniable. Crockett stood taller. Her presence, her restraint, her words, all carried the weight of authenticity. That authenticity is what the crowd cheered for. That authenticity is what the internet amplified. That authenticity is what gave the moment a life larger than politics. As the story spread, it became less about Conway's defeat and more about Crockett's demonstration of principle. People weren't simply laughing at the fall of a spin doctor. They were celebrating the rise of a voice that spoke with honesty and courage. They were celebrating the reminder that even in a world saturated with manipulation, dignity still resonates louder than spin. This is why the clash struck such a chord. It tapped into a truth that goes beyond politics. Arrogance can win a headline, but dignity will always win history. The noise of manipulation may dominate the moment, but it cannot outlast the steady endurance of authenticity. Crockett's reply wasn't just a viral clip. It was a declaration that dignity is still possible, and still powerful. And that's why this single moment will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Jasmine Crockett destroys Kellyanne Conway's argument in seconds. The crowd cheers. That headline wasn't hype, it was history. We watched Conway step forward with her trademark arrogance, certain she could overwhelm with spin and swagger. But instead, it was Crockett's calm courage that commanded the moment. One steady reply, one refusal to bow to condescension, and the crowd's eruption told the whole story. Dignity triumphed. This clash wasn't just about politics, it was about something deeper. It was about the way arrogance always underestimates clarity, and how truth, spoken plainly, can silence manipulation. Crockett didn't need to shout. She didn't need theatrics. She proved that sometimes the most devastating response is the one that comes from unshakable composure. And that's why this moment has traveled far beyond the walls of that stage. Because people everywhere are tired of being dismissed, talked over, or told they don't belong. Crockett stood for them, and in her victory, so many of us saw our own dignity reflected back. If you believe calm courage will always outshine arrogance, share this video. Spread it so that others see the power of composure over chaos. If you want to keep amplifying voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices that rise above manipulation with honesty and strength, subscribe now. Join thousands who are saying enough to spin, and yes to dignity and truth. Because these stories matter. These moments matter. And together we can make sure they're not just remembered, but repeated, again and again, until arrogance has nowhere left to stand. Be part of the movement. Stand with calm courage. And never forget, one voice, spoken with truth, can change everything.